So we are back with another roundtable. The plot keeps thickening with respect to the choice testing scandal that we did a roundtable on earlier in the podcast season, and now we're back for part two. Inspired by a recent discussion that came up on my social media a few weeks ago with two very popular influencer led brands who said publicly, and I was kind of taken aback, and I'm interested in your point of views on this, that the brands that were involved in the drama that had huge discrepancies, for example, SPF 4 versus a marketed claim of SPF 50, have zero responsibility for that discrepancy. And the responsibility entirely falls on the lab. There was fraud that was uncovered by the work from Choice, really commendable work from that group. Are they a nonprofit? Choice did really good work bringing this to attention. And so, obviously, an important topic to continue grappling with. But I'm just going to get to my first question. So, when testing results for personal care products go wrong, for example, with the recent SPF result discrepancies, you can talk past SPF testing as well because this topic extends past SPF testing. Who ultimately is responsible? And also, what do you think about the conversation takeaways that inspired this conversation? Um, Avril, from the legal point of view, do you want to start this? Oh, and I should say, I'm here with two people. I didn't even introduce you guys. I'm terrible. Two people who I think are extremely smart on this kind of topic from the legal kind of regulatory point of view. Avril Love, who is a lawyer who specializes in this kind of stuff. Full disclosure, she hasn't really been following this specific story, but I think some of the takeaways will be broadly applicable. And then Dr. Rania Ibrahim, who has a clinical testing lab, and she is a wealth of knowledge on clinical testing. She's come on my podcast for Clinical Testing 101 with her brother, who is a dermatologist. Go back to the podcast episode if you want a deep dive into the weeds of what clinical testing is and what happens. But okay, I'll stop talking. After that introduction, April.
Okay, so the big question is who bears responsibility when product testing goes wrong? And regardless of what the testing is, um, like anything, it depends. So, assuming that a brand is selling a consumer product, the brand will bear responsibility for the safety and the efficacy of its product, and that will be based on the claims that the product has made with respect to efficacy. Um, if, for example, a brand is making an SPF claim that the product is, I don't know, has a sun protection factor of 30, then the brand will be held to that claim, and as between it and consumers. So consumers would certainly be able to bring a lawsuit claiming that they would have never purchased the product if they had known that the SPF 30 claim was false. And the brand would, have to stand against a suit there, and it would really not um, serve them to point the finger at their testing lab and say, well, we didn't know, as between the brand and consumers. Not that it couldn't bring the testing lab into the lawsuit. So if it were an instance where there really were fraud and the brand had done everything that it could do, the brand could escape liability, but it should definitely expect to be involved in that lawsuit and have to defend itself. As between the brand and the testing lab, obviously the testing lab bears responsibility for testing, and for making truthful statements and not defrauding its clients. But again, the responsibility there is going to depend somewhat on what the contractual provisions say between the parties, to define that relationship, who's responsible for what, etc. So it's really important, number one, first and foremost, that there is an actual contract between the brand and the testing lab, so that it's more than just a purchase order, which really is not. sufficient. If you needed to litigate this kind of a situation, you'd want to have some standards in the contract that define what your lab is actually going to do. And as a brand, you might want to think about provisions that allow you to audit, and make sure that the lab that you've contracted is actually doing what they say they're doing. And if you do have provisions that allow you to audit, then you should be auditing, because you have a duty to ensure to some degree that your contracted partners are doing their job.
Maybe before Rania, you give your take, I will read a response that I got from Dr. Fraser Bell. I had a lot of really good responses on my LinkedIn when I had a call to action to my audience, also on Instagram, for comments about this roundtable, but also questions. So from Dr. Fraser Bell. This is interesting. My longstanding understanding is that the party, product manufacturer, making the claim is responsible for the substantiation of the claims they make. If a third party has generated the technical or consumer data to support a product's claim, it was the choice of the product manufacturer to use the data as claim validation. If the data was falsified or generated using inappropriate methodology, there may be a quarrel between the manufacturer and the third party, but I understand the manufacturer should always have responsibility to their consumer and customers. The choice of selecting third party was ultimately that of the manufacturer. Rania, what do you think about that statement? And then also, Avril, after, if you want to comment on it, by all means. But also to my first question, I feel like this is along the same lines of my first question, anyways.
I guess I'm a little confused by the statement because I mean, how would a manufacturer perform their own testing? Like it's not even their is that what he's kind of
No, I
insinuating?
think what he is saying that essentially it's the responsibility of the, whether it's a manufacturer or like the finished product producer, it's the responsibility of the finished product producer to vet their third party testing labs. They chose to work with that lab, they chose to use that data, and they have the product that's making the claim to the finished product consumer. So like the brands, I think that's what he's trying to refer to there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's so cut and dry. Kind of like what Avril was saying is that or Avery, I'm sorry, I said your name wrong.
It's April.
Avril
It's
was
okay.
saying I don't think it's like so black and white like that. Like I think there are responsibilities on the side of the brand to do their due diligence on the labs that they're using. You can audit, which I think when it comes to sunscreen testing, I think there are other ways that you can determine if a lab is doing things correctly outside of audits. I mean, and the reason that I say that is because I had been to AMA a very long time ago and did a soft audit and was very much aware that because I had the knowledge base, that there was something that was definitely not aligning. um, but I think with audits, sometimes because it's quality systems and it's paperwork, you can pass an audit, right? If you have all of the correct documents in place. Um, I think with sunscreen testing, there's a very easy way to determine if a lab, and I actually I don't do sunscreen testing because I realized at some point in my career that we were seeing several brands lowering actives and telling us that it was a very specific SPF. And as a result, we were burning a lot of subjects because it wasn't protecting. And so, a decision on my end when I started my lab was not to be involved in sunscreen testing because of that carried liability. But a lot of labs will come to me, a lot of brands will come to me and be like, hey, Rania, like I'd like to, I need sunscreen testing. Who do you suggest I use? And oftentimes, what I will say is, look, there several labs. My personal opinion about the best way to vet a sunscreen testing lab is to send them a dummy sample that you know exactly what the SPF factor is. And you essentially, let's say you know that the SPF is 30 and there are standards that you can use that are super, like, the SPF level is like very specific, and you send it to a lab in a dummy sample and you tell them that it's lower. You never say that it's higher than what it actually is, because you don't want to burn people, and you see what the numbers say. And if you told them it was a 4 and it came back as a 15, it was actually a 15, then you know that you potentially have a problem, you know. That's usually been my recommendation in terms of like vetting labs. And then in terms of the responsibility of the brand as formulators, you should have an idea as far as like kind of where your SPF should fall, and there are calculators out there that can help you determine those. But if you keep lowering the actives and your product keeps passing, like, it should be a question mark. If
But
all
then
of your
would it
products
not be at
always
that point?
pass, it should be a
Yeah.
question mark. It should be a question mark.
At that point, though, would that not be the brand's responsibility for vetting? I guess it depends on the contracts in place and
Again,
all
look,
that, but
you
it's like,
know, again, I don't, it's hard to say exact responsibility, right? Because like nothing's set in stone. I think it really just comes down to like the company culture. A lot of times it also comes down to just like knowledge. I mean, some of these like smaller brands just don't even know, right? And they don't even know where to start, and they may not even have the funds. So I feel like, um I don't know, maybe consultants get more involved in those kind of decisions, or it's hard to say that all of the responsibility falls on the brand and all the responsibility falls on the lab. I do think that vast a lot of the responsibility falls on the lab, because you are hiring someone. It's just like, okay, I just had an issue with my accountant. I hired him to do a specific task because I am not an accountant, and he did it incorrectly, right? So it's really, I'd hired him to do something very specific, and he should bear a majority of the responsibility. But some of the responsibility of me is that I just didn't vet my accountant properly.
I know in Canada, if I filed a tax return, even if I had a hired accountant and they did it properly, I'm going to get personally in trouble
Yeah.
because that is my data. I'm going to flip this question to Avril for your thoughts on that. And as you're talking, Rania, about like, yeah, vetting this stuff is super hard. You need to have technical expertise. Also, like doing a test just to vet them, like how many small brands are going to be able to do that, because these tests are
Mhm.
very expensive. And like honestly, when it comes to sunscreen products, unpopular opinion that perhaps the other panelists aren't going to agree with me, and they don't even have to comment, but it's like, this is for a product like sunscreen, why I generally, because I know about the level of expertise required for this, I generally will opt for products from larger brands who I understand they have the resources to do
Mhm.
their due diligence. Avril, and maybe I'll just say, like, whether or not they were ignorant and therefore they had this poor outcome, that doesn't say, like, that doesn't mean there wasn't harm due to that outcome based off of their negligence, even if it was coming from the best of intentions for their products and vetting it and all that. Now, like, I'm maybe not as nice as other people as I'm looking at this. These are just my very, very harsh points of view. So it's actually very nice that you kind of have disagreement with me, so we're not all just like these negative people. But Avril, what do you think?
Well, okay. So, first of all, as a defense attorney, I have to say, whoa, 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 because just just because there is a testing discrepancy does not necessarily mean that there's negligence on the part of the brand,
Mhm.
right? Especially because these folks may not have technical expertise with respect to what the testing requires, how it's done, et cetera. They are hiring experts to to do that for them because they know that they need technical expertise. So, if a brand has been unlucky in hiring a lab that is either not using the best integrity or just doesn't have the scientific chops, whatever the case may be, that's not necessarily negligence on the part of the brand. But, the brand does need to be able to show that it's done whatever it can do, and it's going to be a question of, what is the brand's duty, right? That when negligence is always a question of what is their duty and did they breach that duty. So, the duty probably is to hire vetted experts who have technical experience and can do the testing. And if that's what the brand has done, then at some point it really does fall on the lab, if they've been dishonest or haven't used the best competence in some way. However, unfortunately for the brand, because the brand is in direct relationship with consumers, the brand is often going to be held, left holding the bag, and held responsible, you know, perhaps from a legal liability standpoint, but certainly in, the realm of public opinion. And the brand has to really ask itself, what is the goodwill of the brand worth? Um, because at the end of the day, it's the reputational damage that may be the most problematic for the brand. Even if they can, by contract, go after their testing lab and recoup some of the legal damages, you may never get back your good reputation. And so that's a big consideration. Uh, but I will say, I do agree with Rania, that, the brand has to do something to vet their partners. You want to be able to correctly place trust in the folks that you work with. Um, but I also agree, Jen, that it can be prohibitively expensive to test a dummy, or another option would be to get a second opinion, right, from a different lab to check if there is a concern. So I would say you don't necessarily need to be doing that from the outset. Certainly if there were a concern, like if you kept lowering your active and then you kept passing and there was no change in the SPF factor that your lab was coming back with, that should raise eyebrows, and that would definitely make me say, let's go to another lab and have them tested and see if we can verify these results. And that would be scientifically accurate, right? Like, you want to be able to validate test results. um, but trust but verify is certainly a good way to go. But I think that, short of, you know, double testing products, um, actually contractual provisions can perhaps tell you quite a lot about who you're working with, because, you can negotiate for legal responsibility. And the thing about, let's say, an SPF product, unlike a lot of other cosmetic products where, let's say, you're selling I don't know, a hair repair product and it doesn't perform as promised. Well, that's not actually injuring consumers. But with an SPF product, you could have physical injuries. People get burned and who knows what. So that's a situation under the law where there are physical injuries where, the brand is held strictly liable, whether they're at fault or not. Um, and when you're talking about people who have physical injuries, especially sun injuries, right, where it comes with potential risk for skin cancer, um, the damages for that can be extensive, and you could be on the hook for medical monitoring, right? So, which could go on forever until people, might expect to actually get cancer. So, it's important that your contractual provisions allot responsibility appropriately. And you might want to have a provision where, in the case of fraud or gross negligence on the part of your brand partner, your lab, that they are going to indemnify you for all legal liability, and not just limited to the value of the contract, which is often a provision in contracts. There are like limitations on liability. That the most we're ever going to pay you is for the value of this contract. Well, if your testing was $50,000, that's not going to do it. Um,
Mhm.
so, if you are concerned about it and you negotiate for a lot more, that might tell you something about who you're working with. If they're like, absolutely no way, we won't stand behind our testing, even if there's gross negligence, we're not going to indemnify you in that way. So that's a way, an early way, without paying for another test, that you might be able to push a little and just see who you're dealing with.
This leads really well to another question that I got from my audience, and they're referencing a comment that came up in the previous panel. So I will also bring that up so you guys have context. So the question from Serenade: is the brand responsible if the manufacturer was red listed and put on an import ban by a regulator? For example, Wild Child Laboratories has been red listed by the FDA for years. Is the brand responsible for all issues that come up as a result? If a consultant helped a brand lab shop, then do brands blame them, or the fault is ultimately the brand? And they say this question is inspired by a comment that I made, which is commentary that I heard through the grapevine of things that consultants within some of these product supply chains were telling the brands, where they were viewing PCR as more reliable and therefore a lab that they should work with because they more reliably gave them positive results compared to other labs who sometimes gave bad results. That seems like something you should, as a brand, like pause. That doesn't seem right because you test for a reason. Rania, what do you think?
Um, so as far as like, I mean, I'm not regulatory, I'm not legal. So as far and I'll let Avril kind of answer that part as far as like who does the liability fall on if you know that, like the company that you're working for, the manufacturer has been like flagged by the FDA. I from a legal standpoint, I don't know who the fault would fall on, but I'm going to address this result, and I think me and you have talked about it. In my 15 or 16-year career in clinical testing, I cannot tell you the number of times that I have heard statements from brands or consultants or whatnot where every time I go to this lab, I always get really positive results. And then I went to this other lab and I got a negative result. So I'm just going to go back to the lab that I always get positive results from. And, you know, I have really strong feelings about that because the idea of testing is we don't know what the product is supposed to do. Like, that's why we test, right? Like, that's why we do safety testing. That's why we do consumer perception testing. That's why we do efficacy testing, because we don't know. If we knew, then why would we invest in testing? So that's the whole purpose behind testing. So if a lab is always giving you positive results, or a lab can guarantee you positive results even before they've initiated the study or even during the study, that is a red flag. And I think what happens sometimes is there's so much pressure on brands to perform. And there's so much pressure on brands to have all of these positive results and all of these incredible results to be able to compete. And so when they come up against a test where it was like, wait a minute, I got reactions on my safety test. The other lab that I use, I've been using him for 10 years and I've never had a reaction. I'm just going to go back to the other lab. That that is a perspective in brands that really has to change, and I find it extremely problematic from that standpoint, but it's something that I see all the time. Like it doesn't even phase me anymore, right? Like I'll do a test for someone and they'll be like, wait a minute, like I've never gotten bad results. I'm just gonna go back to my other lab. Like your lab sucks. And I'm like, okay, you know. So that's cherry picking, right? And that's intuitively you cannot um as an intelligent person and with any kind of thought process, not kind of put two and two together of, oh, well, maybe something is not really in alignment if I'm always getting positive data. And then, so that's my 2 cents. I obviously feel very strongly about it because I have to kind of deal with the situation regularly.
And again, my harsh opinion on this, if like I understand, especially for smaller brands, how scary it is, the uncertainty of testing when the everything for product development is so expensive, and then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, what do you mean I might have to redo all this and pay x thousands of dollars for this test, and I can't afford that. I understand the want for positive results, but when something is like so obviously fishy, then it's like I, I just can't see how it's not a brand's responsibility. And if they don't have the capacity to do their due diligence in a way that would keep consumers protected, safe, because putting safe products on the market is their
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, then they should not launch that product. Not everyone has to have a product. Not everyone has to have a brand. Oh my gosh, I'm so negative. I'm sorry. Avril, what do you think?
Okay, well, I do have a lot of thoughts on this,
Yeah.
because
You
brands
thought you
do.
were
I mean, look,
negative? No, Rania told me before that she had to stop being negative.
it's it can be. Look, um, I have an obligation when clients come to me. I have an obligation to tell them the truth. If I do not do that and they find themselves in trouble, I have done them no favors by hiding the facts from them. And any consultant that a brand hires, whether it be a testing lab or someone who's hired to lab shop, anyone who is not forthcoming about risk is not doing the brand any favors. So theoretically, any consultant that you hire to help you with this process also should have signed a contract where they have agreed to uphold a certain standard, and they also can bear some responsibility when things go sideways. If you've launched a product and there's a problem and now consumers are after you, well, whose fault is that? Because consultant, we relied upon you for your good judgment, and you maybe were on notice that there was something wrong with this lab, and now there's a consumer litigation where we're going to dig through all of your emails because they're going to be entitled to see that. And they're going to know about all your conversations with the lab and, hey, send me good results. And those aren't going to look good in front of a jury. So, so yeah, any consultants should consider that their reputations are also at stake, and they may have some skin in the game if they've got a contract. And at the end of the day, it's really much better. Of course, brands want their testing to go well because they've invested a lot
Mm-hmm.
in developing a product, and they maybe have pitched it, and maybe they have got a retailer lined up and they've got contracts, and there's a lot of pressure. You're on a timeline. So test early and use good partners. um, do not put yourself in a position of having to meet a deadline, and you're going to get your testing results 2 weeks before launch. Don't do that, because you need to know, in case there is a problem. So build that in to your timeline and test sooner, um, because sometimes the results may not be good, and if that is the case, you really want to know that before you launch. Um, it's not just the brand reputation with consumers, it's also what about with your retailers? Do you want to have to go to your retailer and recall products? You don't. So, so it's better to just know. And even though it may be bad news, I always say bad news is best delivered fresh. So you want to know right away as soon as you can, because that is the only way to, minimize damage and mitigate any potential exposure. Um, so, that's the thing to do is test early, build in some time so that in case you need to rejigger your formulation and retest, you can do that.
I got a really good question and comment from Jennifer Rudd. So the comment then question was that, well, I think an important part of the conversation isn't just who is responsible, because at the end of the day, brands do hold accountability for the safety and accuracy of their products. But how do we equip founders with the right knowledge to carry out that responsibility? Most early stage brands don't have a scientific background and would reasonably assume that they can trust a testing company's results. Until now, there hasn't been much awareness of what good due diligence looks like, at least in Australia. So the real question becomes, what's the minimum standard of verification a brand should follow? In Australia, the TGA has already shared guidance to help brands choose reputable testing providers, and there are likely more changes on the way, which should make the process clearer and safer for anyone. That would keep the discussion constructive and solutions focused rather than turning into finger pointing. Maybe I should have answered or asked this question earlier.
Look, like there are a variety of ways, but kind of like what we talked about, discussed earlier. It costs money to vet labs. I mean, especially if you don't have the technical expertise, you then have to bring in someone who does have technical expertise who can like vet the lab, whether it's through like an audit or like a third party, or through a consultant. So it's very difficult. I understand like the financial impact on smaller brands to be really able to do the due diligence. I completely get it. And so it's kind of hard to say. Like, I think part of it also is, perhaps reputation, asking questions, talking to other brands, or maybe not other brands, but consultants, doing some deep dive digging. I mean, I've done some deep dive digging on labs, and I've uncovered things that now today, when we kind of see some of the things with some of these labs, it was right there on the internet. But we did a deep dive because that's what, as competitors, we do, right? Like, we want to know what our competition is doing. So yeah, I mean, again, I understand like the cost implications, but that would be without spending money performing an audit. I would say really just doing some like research on the different labs in the area. Talk to some consultants, talk to some regulatory consultants, and maybe even talk to some like organizations. I mean, like the IBA, but that would be my recommendation, outside of like having the funds to just go in and do like an audit.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, which is, regulatory authorities don't always provide clear guidance, particularly with respect to product testing. I often see questions about, what do we have to do to ensure that we have the safety substantiation we need, or that the efficacy testing is the right test, and that it's sufficient, and you're not going to get clear answers from regulatory authorities typically because of the vast array of products. They're just not in the business of telling you, well, for this you need to do this, and for this you need to do that. But you know the small brands who are doing this now are not the first brands who are facing these issues. And so I think it's very good advice what Rania said, to join a trade organization like the Independent Beauty Association, to reach out to a community of people who are facing the same issues, to talk to people and see, what do you do? What works for you? Who do you know? Who do you trust? Because there are people who have been doing this longer than you have, who have a little knowledge that you can benefit from, and who probably are happy to share it. So I would say, get connected to people in the industry, ask around, and then, be curious. So ask a lot of questions, whether it's asking other brands what works for them, who they like to use, and so on. But also in any relationships that you're forming with folks who are going to help you out, I think it's wise to ask them a lot of questions about, what protocol do you have for this? What protocol, do you have protocols? What happens in the event of a recall? Do you have a protocol for that? There are all kinds of questions that can and should be asked, um, because sometimes it's a part of the job that things don't always go just right. In fact, at some point, you do this long enough, they're not going to go just right. You're going to have a problem with microorganisms, or something. And so you need to know, well, what happens when this occurs. um, and you want to know that you are going to be working with a partner who is transparent and who's going to cooperate with you and help you, because if you do have a stability issue or something like that, you need to know that when you ask them for information about a production or your testing, that they're going to provide that information that you need, so that you can assess, what do I do next. So I think asking a lot of questions up front as you're forming a relationship will probably tell you a lot.
This next question comes from Christine. Initially, they commented, "Wow," for the inspiration of this podcast. That mentality of bearing no responsibility tells me they don't conduct due diligence on any of their partners, which is really scary. What equally scared me, well, maybe especially scared me for this specific case, is this brand is very public about their uh, pipeline right now, product development pipeline of developing a sunscreen product. And then they said on a very large platform that the brands that got caught up on this had no responsibility. Like, I can understand if there's some nuance, like this lab sucked, they were doing fraud, and yeah, that shit. But to say no responsibility, like, my jaw when I was listening to that just dropped, especially when I'm seeing like things in the comments of people like, these brands did everything right. This one brand did everything right. Where there was commentary published from this brand where they were pushing back that the choice testing, like, they did it wrong and their products were actually good, and they actually made this statement that it was scientifically impossible for their sunscreen product to have such low SPF, and that was published. It's like, that, if you're saying like that is the right course of action to respond to this, like, what are you talking about? Sorry, I'll get to the question. I agree with you, Christine, but the question, I would ask, where in product development to commercialization pipeline brands draw the line and just point the finger elsewhere? Is it the sourcing step of their private label SKUs, only for custom, anything that is outsourced, only product testing? Where is the line drawn?
I'm gonna let you go
Okay.
first.
Yeah, maybe. So at the end of the day, if you sell the product to the consumer, they're going to sue you, because it's your name on the product that they bought. Um, and, it might be a situation where you really are not at fault. You have not done anything wrong. except perhaps be unlucky in trusting the wrong partner. And you know, so it might be a situation like that, but um, a brand is very, very likely to be caught in the middle of that anyway. And it is the brand's good name that will be dragged through the mud. And it is the brand that is likely going to have to uh, defend a consumer lawsuit. Um, if the brand is selling at a retailer, you probably have a contract with your retailer where you have agreed to indemnify them. So if your retailer gets sued, guess what? You're getting a letter from them saying, hey, there's a lawsuit that's been brought against us too, and you're going to pay for our defense, right? Um, so, so, the brand has a lot at risk and should prioritize, you know, protecting itself and consumers as much as possible. Um, because, in reality, even if even if someone has concealed facts from the brand and intentionally defrauded the brand, and the brand really has no liability, unfortunately the reality is that the brand is still going to have to spend a lot of money to prove that is true, and um and suffer reputational damage in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I've seen a lot of, not a lot, but I've seen some brands that really are doing everything on their end to do things the right way, right? And it's unfortunate sometimes that some of these brands fall into testing with a lab that they felt that they trusted and kind of get caught up in this. So it's again, it's really hard. And kind of what Avril said is, at the end of the day, it's your brand and it's your company, and you're going to be the one on the hook for it. And at times, I think it's important for brands to kind of maybe even look at it from like a bigger picture, as opposed to in the sense that maybe I spend the money up front now to vet a lab or to hire a consultant that can help vet labs, or to pay the money up front now to do the vetting, because a lawsuit or an issue down the road is far more expensive. I mean, I call my lawyer and he breathes and I get a bill, right? So perhaps that is one way to look at it. But I get it. I get it, right? Like I've seen so many brands bootstrapping it, and it's complex. And I think a lot of it sometimes, and I'm a gut instinct kind of person. Like I operate off of gut, and there are a lot of people that I've talked to who, with, the lab a long time ago, when, they interact with, and they're like, it was just a gut instinct. Like I knew something was not okay. And sometimes that also is like worth, kind of paying attention to. But it's just complicated with smaller brands.
Maybe I'll ask this next question from Stisen. I've probably have mispronounced your username. The question was, what steps can a brand take to have all their bases covered when it comes to testing? So I guess from the clinical testing point of view, Rania, do you want to start? And then from the legal point of view, Avril, you can comment after.
I would say your number one is audit. It shows that you've done your due diligence to check a lab, and to make sure that they have the quality systems and the SOPs and the training and all of the necessary documentation in place to show that they are operating on the up and up. I would say that's the first step, if financially possible. And then also, It's a really small industry. I mean, as large as it is, as small as it is, right? Like it's almost like a little bit incestuous in the sense that it's, with the cosmetic industry. And I think just asking enough questions and talking to people who have been in the industry for a long time and who have had experience with various labs. And I think that's also, a second line of defense if you can't afford to do an audit, because if you're a new brand, there's no way you can do the audit. You're just not technical enough to do it, so you would need to hire an independent company to do that for you. But I think those two things would be good ways to initially determine what kind of which lab you're going to engage with in terms of testing. And then as time goes on, again, what is it, if it's too good to be true? I have an echo.
Do you have it now?
Let's see. No.
Avril, I just muted you. I think the echo is coming from you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, anything that's too good to be true is probably too good to be true. I mean, if you're always getting like these amazing results, then you should be asking questions.
Avril, you may have to unmute yourself now. But do you want to comment from the legal regulatory kind of point of view?
Sure. I would say to have all your bases covered when it comes to testing is a really broad question. But your testing is going to depend on your product and your product claims. So you need to start from the big picture of what is it you're trying to achieve, and what do you want to say to consumers about this product. So you need to know that you want to have kind of your wish list of here's what we want to do with this product, and this is what we need to verify, right, through testing. Yep, it definitely has to be safe. You need to know that it's safe. If you're gonna make a claim that the product is, um, safe for people with sensitive skin, well, you gotta test it in people with sensitive skin. And if you wanna, market specifically to kids or I don't know, some other specific population, you got to test it in that population. Um, Efficacy is the same. You need to know what all of the claims are that you want to make on your artwork, on your website, draft up your big wish list of claims and then speak to a regulatory or legal consultant about, the risks that may be associated with those claims and then narrow down from that giant wish list. All right, here's what claims we're comfortable with respect to whatever our risk tolerance is as a company. And now you take those vetted claims and you design tests that help you verify those claims. Um, a lot of times when I see testing, it's already been done. You know, I'm sort of they want to get everything approved for launch, and so they're like, all right, now let's put it in front of legal. Um, that's the wrong order to do it. You got to go talk to your regulatory or legal consultant first, and then include someone like me, when you're designing your testing, because a lot of times there are problems with test design that then can compromise your claims later. So you want to know what those claims are first, then you want to test them. You want to make sure that your test design makes sense. You want to make sure you have enough people in your study so that you can actually get statistically significant results. Um, you know, and you need to kind of think about exactly what is the nature of the product and the testing so that you can understand how to do it. Um, some types of claims require really long-term testing. If you want to, I don't know, well, I won't even get into that, but you need to think about that. Whereas, others, you don't need to do that. You don't need to plan such long-term tests. But so it's really claim and product specific, but testing for safety, testing for efficacy, and of course, working with partners who you can trust the testing results is extremely important. Um, and then, you just want to make sure that the testing that you've done actually lines up with the claims that you want to make, which you would be shocked to know how often that does not occur.
I feel like I maybe like I we went into the deep end right away with this conversation, and I probably should have asked this question that came up from my audience earlier. I think this is funny. I'm working on my thesis, one of my thesis articles, and this was a feedback from one of my mentors of like, "Wow, he just like went right in there." It was very jarring. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I did that to you guys who are listening. So back to some basics with this question from Anna. I think a lot of people don't realize how regulated claims are. There is a misconception that brands can say anything that they want. So I think that this question kind of touches on that misconception. So the question is from Anna, who comments and then asks, I think I'm a little confused about the requirements for efficacy testing in non drug products. Like, we've all seen infomercials where products are making claims that we can be pretty confident they're not going to work the way that the product is marketing. So, why would a moisturizer have to show efficacy for a claim of softer looking skin? While I'm sure we've all tried non cosmetic products that totally don't do what they say. And I guess it's really a matter of what the specific claim that they're making and how it will have to then be validated. But yeah, who wants to start with this question? Maybe from a legal point of view, Avril, do you want to
Sure.
comment?
Yeah, of course. So I think there is a lot of confusion because in our industry, there seems to be a lot of focus on FDA, and that's important. But equally important and often somehow forgotten is the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates all advertising of all products. And the rules are, actually pretty simple. The FTC expects that if you make an advertising claim, it is truthful and non misleading. And in order to be truthful and non misleading, you must have a reasonable basis for making that claim before you make it. So there has to be some kind of support or substantiation for the claim. And the the degree of support or substantiation is often claims driven. So if you are making a claim that is actually very easy for a consumer to evaluate, like improves the appearance of my skin, or makes skin feel soft and smooth, well, that's something that a consumer can use the product and say, yeah, it does make my skin feel soft and smooth. So maybe the support for that is based on, in a case of a moisturizer, well-known ingredients, for which there's a lot of data out there already. But you need to have the data, you need to have those studies, but that doesn't, you don't necessarily need to run your own. um, Alternatively, if you have a really novel active ingredient and you're making a claim that's difficult for a consumer to evaluate, for example, um, balances the skin microbiome, how is a consumer going to know if it does that? So you would need to have actual clinical testing that reflects what the microbiome is on the skin after use of the product, and that it's actually balancing it and what that means. And that could require a battery of tests. So, again, the, the, the testing that you need is claims dependent. And if you want to say clinically proven, which everybody wants to say, then you need to have actually done a clinical test, which means using instrumentation to measure something objectively measurable, as opposed to, giving consumers your product to use and asking them for survey responses, which is consumer perception testing. So I think there's still some confusion about that. And I've seen lawsuits over that issue. Um, so, it's very important basically to have some support for the claim. There are all kinds of different ways that you can verify, consumer perception, clinical testing. You might have information from your ingredient supplier. Advertising brochures are not going to be very strong support, but if you have their actual testing data, that could help. But you need to have enough information so that you can understand if someone else has run a test, does the amount of active that they tested, is it the same as what you're using in your formulation? Is the administration the same? Did they test it in a leave-in situation, but you're a rinse-off product? So there just needs to be enough information. You have to have data so that you can understand, is this generalizable to our product? Um, and then there are many options. A lot of ingredients have been extensively tested, and there may be information out there in the literature that you can rely on and use, but you have to have it.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the claim. It's complex and it depends. The answer that nobody likes to hear. I'm sorry, that's what it is. I also wanted to bring up a point that Meredith Patillo brought up on my podcast earlier this season that I think gets at some of this confusion that I see a lot with consumers. They're like, well, this claim is not, well, they're not going to say it this way, but like it's not compliant. They're making an illegal drug claim. So therefore, everyone's doing it. It must be fine. Or this claim is obviously not supported. They don't have any evidence that is available to me to see if it's reliable. And therefore, none of the claims are validated. The example that, oh, sorry, I'll extend this. And therefore, it's allowed. Therefore, companies can do whatever they want. And so the analogy that Meredith gave was with respect to speed limits and people speeding. Like, it's illegal to go over the speed limit, but like, you may do it. Just because you do it doesn't mean that it's not illegal. Doesn't mean you won't get caught if you get in trouble. Doesn't mean that you're not representing a safety risk to the people around you and yourself. So just because you got away with it doesn't mean that it's right or illegal. And I think that's a really good analogy for people to think about. For like, there are a lot of claims out there that are illegal drug claims, as one example, or like they don't have the support that they should. Um, it's challenging for all the claims out there to be caught. There's only so many regulators and lawyers that are looking at this stuff where brands may get into trouble for that. But just because they don't get into trouble, similarly to speeding, doesn't mean it's legal. I'm going to maybe. Oh, sorry. I'll stop talking. April?
Oh, well, I was just going to say I agree with everything you just said. And there are actually, I mean, certainly there are a lot of claims out there that are drug claims, or they are not verified, they don't have support. But there are a lot of consumer attorneys out there who are monitoring and who are happy, thrilled to see those claims out there, because that's that's a source of income for them, and it's
Mm-hmm.
keeping me working too, defending them. So there are a lot of folks out there, and you might also be surprised that I think your competitors, to some degree, could come after you for making claims. And we do see that with some of the larger brands who act as enforcers, because they have to compete in the market too, and they know, they can't be out there making drug claims. They're a big target, so you might hear from them, because they can bring you in front of the National Advertising Division of the BBB and raise a challenge. And then what are you going to do when you don't have support for your claims?
And now, two other questions I probably should have asked earlier on in this conversation. I'll direct them both to Rania. And they don't quite fit together, but I just want to
Okay.
get them out of the way. I think they're important context to this conversation. I'm sorry for getting to them later. So, the first question is in relation to the cost of these tests, just so people understand like the challenges with costs.
Mhm.
What are the kinds of costs that might be associated with some of the efficacy related claims? And then the second question that is not really relevant but still important in this conversation, can you give us like a 101 breakdown of some of the historical challenges of fraud in testing companies that the cosmetics industry has seen over the last few decades, just for some context? And maybe I'll also say earlier in the conversation, Rania brought up AMA labs. They are another lab that historically has had fraud issues, and the owner went to jail. So that
Exactly.
was just, is that what happened? Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
correct me. So
He's
what's
out now.
happening? Oh yeah.
Don't go to jail. Yes. So in terms of cost, right? Um, Safety testing, which is the the most popular safety test, the most basic safety test that people do here in the US is the RAPT. It's not an arm and a leg. Like it's not that expensive. So it's in my opinion, it's not cost prohibitive in a sense that a brand would say, "Oh, I'm not going to spend, you know, $1,200 to get safety." It is extremely inexpensive. I mean, obviously, every lab is very different, but you're not going to pay more than $2,000 according to which lab you go to in order to do your safety testing. So that is a non-negotiable. And it's so in terms of safety testing. Now, in terms of efficacy testing, and this is what I always tell like newer brands, right? Especially because I work with a lot of like smaller indie brands because we don't have these conversations with the larger brands because they do everything and they go above and beyond because they have a lot of visibility in the marketplace. So it's the smaller newer brands. Consumer perception testing is the least expensive way of you making marketing claims. Once you start getting into like instrumentation and imaging, the cost of the study becomes much more expensive. So from the strategy of a newer brand, you have to do your safety testing. And if you want marketing claims, then start with the softer claims. Do your consumer perception. You give surveys to people, it's controlled to some degree, and then you're making claims that are very clearly more consumer perception driven, felt, saw, you know, that sort of stuff. And then as you start to begin, and you have to be careful that you're making those claims that way and not saying clinically shown. I hate the word clinically proven, by the way. So I usually say clinically shown, like clinically shown to say, that it's like an increase in hydration. You can't make those kind of claims from consumer perception. And then as you grow as a brand and you start gaining traction, you start gaining revenue, then you can start investing in instrumentation. So that's always the advice that I give individuals. And to go back to the question that you had brought up before, if you're going to say something, make sure that you have the data to support it. Whatever that data looks like, just make sure that you have the data to support it. Because while the NAD and the FTC are official, like they officially regulate the claims, in today's day and age, consumers unofficially regulate brands because they question and they want data and they'll dig and everything is at their fingertips. So that is how those are your unofficial regulators, is your consumers. In terms of like historical issues, I mean, we brought it up. AMA was probably one of the first labs that really shook the industry. We all felt it as other labs because they were a very large lab. They were a very popular lab. They did a lot of testing and it shook the industry because a lot of people and a lot of brands realized that they had products on the market that they were selling, whether it was a sunscreen or a cosmetic, and they were making these claims. And now they just realized that this lab had essentially pulled these numbers out of thin air. And that was probably one of the biggest scandals that we saw in this industry. And at the time, we saw a lot of pressure from brands, whereas labs, they were like, oh, well, we got to start auditing and we're going to question and we want to see this and we want to see that. And we saw that pressure for some time. And then it kind of just like relaxed a little bit. And then we went back to, well, I just want really positive results. And not everyone does that. But We just want really positive results. And, unfortunately, because it is the nature of the beast, when one AMA closes, another one kind of takes its place. And it's just how sometimes life for us as humans kind of operate in this universe. Um, and, there's always a customer for that lab, unfortunately. There's always a customer.
This next question is a legal question from Testaholic, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to give like specific examples, but like ballparks for costs associated with some of this stuff. So from Testaholic, what concrete legal consequences can a brand actually face when its sunscreen is later shown to have incorrect testing? Because it seems like not much, no steep fines, no civil lawsuits, not even in the US where that is doable, unless they are caught in a bigger media scandal like it happens now in Australia and suffer reputational damage and having to do recalls, etc. Um,
Okay.
uh, she also continues,
Oh,
and
she goes
do
on.
brands ever pursue legal action against the laboratories or contract manufacturers involved in such failures? Should they?
Mm.
Okay. Good questions. I will just say that in the case of a sunscreen, which is an over the counter drug in the United States, if the SPF factor is incorrect, the product would be considered to be misbranded, and the FDA would have authority to recall the product. Um, and if it was a situation where it was a well known testing lab and they had a lot of products that they tested, it could be a situation where the FDA actually does get involved because, maybe there's an issue with one brand that then, the FDA tracks down and goes to the lab and finds out it's 27 brands. And the FDA is concerned and essentially gets involved and says, you all need to issue a recall. And if the recall is not voluntary, then the FDA has the power to do it. So, um, you know, in a situation where the fault is really lies with the testing lab, you might not have a situation where the government wants to penalize brands with civil penalties and such, but um, but certainly you would have at the very least, I would expect a recall risk, and recalls can be quite expensive and can impact brand reputation because people who bought your sunscreen might now also not have faith in any of your other products and want to return those. So that's one issue. Another issue, of course, is the FTC could get involved, but much more likely than that is the consumer attorneys. The consumer attorneys who have a lot of incentive to pursue legal action on behalf of consumers. And you actually, with an SPF concern, you have sort of double trouble because you'll have lawsuits that are brought for economic injuries. My client would have never purchased your product had they known that your SPF claim was false and misleading. And they purchased your product for $7.50 and they want their money back on behalf of every single person who purchased your product in the last 4 years, which is typically the statute of limitations for these kinds of claims. So now you're looking at to having potential exposure for the entirety of your sales for 4 years for whatever products are affected. And it's not your profits that you're going to have to pay back; it's your revenues. So it's a losing situation. And then there's the other risk is that people will make personal injury claims as well. And personal injury claims expose you to strict liability because they'll say that the product was defective and that it did not contain appropriate warnings, and that people will claim injuries, whether it's sunburn or risk of skin cancer or something like that. And that's a much bigger potential liability, even than your sales. So those are the possible consequences. How likely is it to happen? Well, certainly if there's publicity, it's very likely. If it's a quieter situation, it's less likely. But really, it just takes one person to say, I used your sunscreen 10 times and I got a sunburn every time. And I think there's something wrong. And they go to, I don't know, a forum, let's say, and they find a bunch of other people who are talking about this. And now, they find an attorney, or
Hmm.
often the attorney will find them. Um, if sometimes actually attorneys have relationships with labs, and they know, it might be, if you have a testing lab that has an issue, you might have a competitor lab who's out there and knows that this testing lab is not doing the work, and they can have relationships with attorneys, and they're like, we know that there's some dishonest dealers out there, and they're testing products that are putting people at risk, and that's another way that this can kind of get out. And then you have attorneys coming out of the woodwork and raising this to the public eye. So so I you know i think that there is pretty significant risk, even in a situation where you don't have really well publicized, uh, I don't know, fraud or concerns. You still have significant risk out there, especially with a sunscreen product. And then, the question is, should you take legal action against your contract manufacturer or your testing lab or whatever, for whatever the concern may be? That's a business, it's a business judgment, right? Because if you do take legal action, you may be exposing a problem with the product that could then expose you to risk from consumer litigation if you don't have that already. So it's a business judgment what you want to do. Um, but at the very least, you might want to raise it, if you have concerns about risks, and you need to work with a testing lab to kind of get to the bottom and find out, what happened here. You need to know about your own product and what you're selling. So I often think that conversations will need to be had, even if they do not rise to the level of litigation.
So we're running short on time here, but I think we covered a lot so far. So I'm just gonna ask one question, and then I'm gonna make it a two like pronged question. Do you have any top take homes or suggestions that you'd give to consumers and then brands? What would your top take homes be to both of those groups? Rania, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think for consumers is do your research. I think there's so much information that's available at our fingertips, but do it wisely, because unfortunately there's also a lot of misinformation. I think that so that would be what I would recommend to consumers, in terms of like finding brands that they can establish trust with, because I think that's like really important, because there are so many brands. And how do you make a choice as to who, like what brands that you align with? And then from the brand perspective is do right by your consumer. I mean, it's do the testing that you need. Like, don't say anything about your product in terms of claims unless you've actually substantiated it. Do your due diligence in terms of finding the right partners, and it's not only testing labs, it's the right partners in terms of like ingredient suppliers and contract manufacturers, because we see it not just on the testing level, but then we see here about like contract manufacturers not putting in, saying that there's 2% of this ingredient but it's really not in there. So I think that's how you do right by your consumers, really vetting. And I understand that auditing is expensive, but you have a network of people in this industry that you can reach out to uh, to to help with that vetting process. And you may still do that, and unfortunately, have an issue, but at least you try to do your due diligence. And I think that's all we can ask is make the effort.
Vet your vetters too. Don't just
Yes,
like
vet your
assume that
vetters,
the
vet your vetters,
consultant is
vet
gonna.
those. Oh my God. I've just talked to some consultants. I'm like, what?
April.
Yes. For consumers, I would say, it's very difficult for consumers to really know about the products that they purchase, because there are a lot of consumers out there who are asking good questions and smart questions, and consumers have become extremely sophisticated, in terms of what they are doing to kind of do their research. But a lot of times, brands will not be totally transparent with consumers. And actually, as someone who represents brands, I advise them not to be, because a lot of that stuff is proprietary. They need to protect the information about their formulation and how they do things. So brands have good and non-nefarious reasons not to share certain information, but that does make it harder for consumers always to know. And so they are in a situation where they do have to really place some faith in brands. And so, as Rania said, I think it's important to, be able to put trust in a brand and have a relationship with brands that are, you know, have a track record of doing things the right way. So, I don't know how helpful that is to consumers, but for brands, I would say, I advise brands now because I started out just defending them in lawsuits. And I often found myself in a situation where I was defending a lawsuit and I wished that I had known this brand 5 years earlier so that we could change some of the facts. So I could have said, "Hey, don't do this other thing. Let's do this a different way." So the advice that I would give to brands is always to think a little bit more long term in making your business decisions. Imagine if in 3 years you have to explain what you're doing right now to consumers in front of a jury. Are you going to be proud of what you did? Um, or would you wish you had done something else?
I also have a suggestion for consumers. Um, in terms of vetting the brands that you put faith in, like some of this stuff is really hard to see because it's not necessarily visible to you. There are things that are visible to you that you can look at. For example, the claims the brands are making on their social media, their packaging, on their website. Like, what are the words that they're saying? Just learn a little bit about claims rules and labeling rules. And so then, when you see brands making illegal drug claims, or maybe their ingredient list isn't using inky nomenclature, like it's an easy thing to get right. Why did they get wrong? If they failed to do their due diligence there to hire the right partners to help them, like with a regulatory consultant. Those are pretty easy things to get right, in my opinion. Maybe this is unkind, but I think it's true. If they cut corners there, what other corners did they cut? That's visible to you. And I'll say that some of the brands that I saw getting caught up with some of this, I did see these issues. And it's not that surprising that they weren't able to vet some of their partners. Maybe I'll edit that part out because that's kind of rude. But look to claims, look to what they're saying to you, understand just a little bit about the rules, and then I feel like it makes it a lot easier to find more credible brands. And that concludes our roundtable. Thank you, Radia and Avril,